let's shift to the
Right,
pardon
pardon
power.
power. Hmm.
Yeah. So the reason I am so concerned about the way the pardon power might now play into this Supreme Court opinion is that the Supreme Court said, look, one of the sort of exclusive and preclusive duties of a president is to talk to his attorney general. And because he has to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, he can tell his attorney general to prosecute anybody he wants, which I'm sorry. But to me, when you know Donald Trump will tell his attorney general, prosecute people regardless of an absence of evidence that they've committed crimes, we're weaponizing DOJ against my enemies. It seems to me that we're not allowed to look behind that, right? Under this
Correct.
new
No
Supreme
motive.
Court
Yeah.
opinion. You can't go into a president's motive. So basically, they literally gave him license to commit crimes and use the Department of Justice to do it. Of course, the attorney general, if he goes up and rounds up and unlawfully detains without cause, without charges, without due process, all of Donald Trump's enemies, Donald Trump can't be prosecuted, but the attorney general could be prosecuted unless Donald Trump exercises one of his other core presidential powers, the power of the pardon. He could pardon his attorney general and all other DOJ officials who complied with his unlawful orders to round up and detain his enemies. And where does that leave us as a nation, as a democracy, as a government? What say you about all of that?
Yeah, I mean, you and I talked about this. The pardon power is the shotgun in the closet to basically effectuate this Oval Office crime spree that has just been greenlighted by the United States Supreme Court. And I say this because take unofficial conduct. Say the president in his personal possession has a handgun and shoots someone with his own personal handgun. Presumably that would still be unofficial act. So maybe he could be prosecuted for that murder. Fifth Avenue, Donald Trump's bragged about that for years. In order to use the official power that has immunity, he's going to have to get people within the federal government to go along with it. He's going to have to get law enforcement, U.S. Marshals, FBI agents, DEA agents. And if he's using the military, he's going to have to get military personnel. And they have an obligation. They answer to the commander in chief, but they also have an obligation not to follow unlawful orders. So what are they going to do? Because to your point, this doesn't protect them. Well, Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon when there was no indictment yet. That was a new thing, right? That created a historical precedent for Donald Trump going in office and saying, here's Project 2025. I don't know if you've talked about that with your viewers, but this is the blueprint for this kind of authoritarian government. It's out there, 900 pages. People are finally talking about it. Here's the part on DOJ being weaponized. Here's your marching orders. I just want to tell you, I'm giving you a presumptive pardon. On my last day in office, I will sign it. So you are scot-free in committing these crimes. Essentially, my immunity will extend to you because I'm going to pardon you. And the Supreme Court has said you can't look behind a pardon.
I know you take up all of these issues in your book, Pardon Power. What is it that you learned in the research and the writing of this book? And are there a couple of important takeaways that maybe we don't all know regarding the pardon power? We kind of generally know what it involves, what it entails. We know how broad it is. We know how it's not often subject to challenge. When you see Donald Trump, for example, not only pardoning his criminal associates, but his son in law's daddy and all sorts of it feels wrong, but we sort of know how broad and sweeping the presidential pardon power has always been regarded. But what can you share with our viewers about your research and writing of this book that we should know about the pardon power?
I think the overwhelming assumption amongst lawyers, commentators, even law professors is that the pardon power is absolute. That is, that there's no limitations on it that can be imposed. This was even really conceded by counsel for Jack Smith in the United States Supreme Court. And my research, that's not actually accurate. For example, the Supreme Court has held if as part of your criminal sentence you have to pay a penalty, the president pardons you, you can't get your money back because that would conflict with Congress's appropriations power, Congress's power of the purse. So there's an example of a constraint on the pardon power that the Supreme Court has recognized that is imposed by the other parts of the Constitution. And so I argue in the book that corrupt pardons, to the extent to which they violate the separation of powers and the rule of law, would not be constitutional. Now, of course, this case, it's not about the pardon power. Someone would argue, well, look what the Supreme Court did. But as you and I talked about, I think what the Supreme Court did is unconstitutional itself. The other big takeaway that people, I think, not so much as a matter of law, but just as a matter of, oh, the pardon power, presidents have this pardon power. There are two main justifications historically for the pardon power, which goes all the way back to the Bible. Pontius Pilate pardoned Barabbas, the murderer, instead of Jesus, because the people were given the choice and said, crucify Jesus. So this is, with the exception of China, every country has some version of this, but it does two things. It's supposed to be about mercy, because in England, under these these monarchs, there was no criminal justice system, Glenn. There was no due process clause. There was no Fourth Amendment. There was no Fifth Amendment. There was no process. And so people did get in situations where there was really unfair justice being handed down, and the king could forgive them. The second historical precedent is for what's called amnesty, where a president, like, for example, Jimmy Carter, pardoned the draft dodgers in Vietnam War, just to be able to have the nation heal and move on. So the idea that the pardon power could be used to abuse office, to entrench power, to stay in the presidency to beyond the 8-year maximum under the Constitution, for example, however we can hypothesize it, I would say even before Trump versus United States, that was not consistent with the history and the case law around the pardon power. It's just snippets of cases from the Civil War that people have blown up into this idea that presidents can pardon whoever they want, even for corrupt reasons. I think it's always been wrong. And coupled, as you and I just talked about, with Trump versus United States, it's even more wrong now, because it would greenlight not just a criminal president, but a criminal, crime gang conspiracy in the Oval Office and in the executive branch writ large.
And Kim, believe me, I wrote down your statement that the pardon power is the shotgun in the closet to effectuate the president's criminal scheme, and I will be using it, but I will give you attribution. That was beautifully put. What do you think this Supreme Court opinion has done to the pardon power? Has it expanded it? Has it made it even more difficult? I guess depending on what the president uses it for, but has it made it even more difficult to kind of go behind what to us feels like a corrupt and even a criminal pardon?
I think on one hand, yes, because they made it really clear, pardon power is absolute, but I would argue that's always been what everybody assumed anyway. I think it could put more of a spotlight on the pardon power as a problem, as something people need to pay attention to. Governors have more power and states have more power over actual pardons than presidents, and that, as you know, there are many more people that are convicted and jailed under state law than under federal law. And, a lot of states don't have unlimited power in the governor's office. So I would say, and I make the argument in my book, there are things Congress can do. Maybe this opinion makes it harder, but I would say I think it puts a spotlight on how neglected the pardon power has been, and that Congress probably needs to really seriously look at it and scrutinize these pardons. The media needs to look at it, and there needs to maybe be some pushback on this assumption, given that, as you just articulated, we've been talking about, it is now corrupt pardons aren't just something you do on your way out of office to your buddies, but corrupt pardons could actually be used against the American people in extremely treacherous ways.
Justice matters.